The words were barely audible. Sammy Davis Jr. leaned into the microphone, his voice destroyed by throat cancer, and whispered something to Johnny Carson. Johnny stopped the show, pulled Sammy close, and started crying. What Sammy said in those final words would be played at his funeral 8 weeks later. It was March 13, 1990, and everyone at NBC Studios knew this was going to be different. Sammy Davis Jr. was scheduled to appear on The Tonight Show. But the Sammy they'd known for 40 years, the one who could sing for hours without stopping, dance until the audience was exhausted just watching, and light up a stage with pure charisma, wasn't the Sammy who would walk through those doors tonight. The throat cancer had been diagnosed in August 1989. By March 1990, it had ravaged his body completely, stolen his voice entirely, and left him with maybe 2 months to live if he was lucky. His doctors had told him to rest at home to conserve what little energy he had remaining, to spend his final weeks quietly with family and loved ones, preparing for the inevitable. But Sammy had other plans. Sammy Davis Jr. had never done anything quietly in his entire life. "I need to do Johnny's show one more time," he told his wife, Levis, his voice barely above a whisper, even in private conversation. "I need to say goodbye. I need to thank them. I need to tell them what they meant to me." The Tonight Show staff had been warned extensively. Sammy would need help walking to the chair. He couldn't stand for long periods. His voice was barely a whisper. Speaking caused him physical pain, and the cancer had damaged his vocal cords so severely that sometimes no sound came out at all, just air and effort. Johnny Carson had been given the same information during his pre-show briefing that afternoon. His producers had sat him down and prepared him as best they could. But what the briefing couldn't prepare him for, what nothing could prepare him for, was seeing his friend, one of the greatest and most dynamic entertainers who'd ever lived, reduced to this fragile shell of the man he'd once been. When Sammy walked onto the Tonight Show stage that night, the studio audience didn't know whether to applaud or cry. Many did both. The applause started, then faltered, then became something else entirely. A standing ovation mixed with audible sobs, a recognition of both who this man had been and what was happening to him now. He'd lost at least 40 pounds, maybe more. The tuxedo that had once fit him perfectly, that had been tailored to his exact measurements, now hung loose on his diminished frame. He moved slowly, carefully, deliberately, like each step required calculation and courage and a conscious decision to keep going. But his eyes, those famous expressive eyes that had sparkled through 1,000 performances on 1,000 stages, still had that light, that fierce determination that had defined his entire 6-decade career. Johnny stood up from his desk immediately and walked over to help Sammy to the guest chair, abandoning the usual protocol of letting guests walk over themselves. The two men embraced, and even from the back row of the audience, you could see Johnny fighting with everything he had to keep his composure to not break down completely. "Sammy," Johnny said as they both sat down, his voice already thick with emotion that he couldn't hide. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming tonight." Sammy tried to speak, but at first nothing came out except air. He touched his throat gently, smiled apologetically at the audience, and tried again with visible effort. This time, a whisper emerged, rough, painful to hear, barely carrying the few feet to the microphone. "Had to come see my friend. One more time." The audience was dead silent. No applause, no reaction, no movement. Just 12 million people across America watching something profoundly heartbreaking unfold on live television. Johnny leaned forward immediately, moving his chair several inches closer so Sammy wouldn't have to strain his destroyed voice. "We've been doing this for almost 40 years now." Sammy nodded slowly, managing a smile despite everything. He raised his fingers, trying to indicate the number of years, trying to show the depth of their friendship. But even that simple gesture seemed to exhaust him completely. "You've been on this show more times than I can count," Johnny continued. And everyone watching could hear the emotion building in his voice, threatening to overwhelm him completely. "You've made us laugh until we couldn't breathe. Made us cry with your performances. Made us believe that entertainment could be art and magic and pure joy. You've given us everything, Sammy. Everything you had." Sammy reached out with a trembling hand and touched Johnny's arm. then his hand. Then, with tremendous effort that was visible to everyone watching, he whispered something that the audience sitting in the studio couldn't quite hear clearly. Johnny immediately leaned in closer, turning his ear directly towards Sam's mouth so he could catch every word. What Sammy said in that moment, what he whispered to Johnny Carson while 12 million people watched from their homes across America, what he managed to force through his cancer-destroyed throat would become one of the most legendary and heartbreaking moments in the entire history of television. Tell them I love them all. Every single one, the audience, the people who gave me everything I ever had. Tell them. Johnny pulled back slowly, looking at Sammy with tears now openly streaming down his face. No attempt to hide them or wipe them away. He turned to the camera to the millions watching in living rooms across the country and repeated Sam's words with a voice breaking from emotion. Sammy wants you to know, Johnny said, fighting through tears to get the words out clearly, that he loves you. All of you. Everyone who ever came to a show, bought a record, watched him perform on television. He says you gave him everything. Everything he ever had in his life. The studio audience erupted, not in applause or cheers, but in audible sobs and crying. The camera operators were crying behind their equipment. The crew members, visible in the background, had their hands over their faces, shoulders shaking. Ed McMahon was weeping openly at his desk, not even trying to hide it. The sound engineer later said he'd never heard anything like it in 40 years of television production. But Sammy wasn't done. He had more to say. He leaned into the microphone again. And this time, with every ounce of strength and determination he had left in his failing body, he managed to speak slightly louder. Still a whisper, still rough and painful to hear, but just slightly louder than before. The greatest privilege of my life was making people smile, making them forget their troubles for a few hours. He paused, gathering breath, gathering strength. I got to dance and sing and make people happy. What else could a man possibly want from this life? Johnny couldn't speak. He just sat there holding his friend's frail hand, crying without shame or embarrassment in front of millions of people across America. Then Sammy did something nobody expected, something incredible. He looked at the band, looked at Doc Severson, who was crying behind his trumpet, and made a small gesture, the universal signal for music to begin. Sammy, you don't have to, Johnny started to say. But Sammy shook his head firmly. He pulled the microphone closer, and with a voice that was barely there, with vocal cords destroyed by cancer, with only weeks left to live, Sammy Davis Jr. tried to sing one more time. I've got to be me. I've got to be me. The notes were wrong. The voice cracked and failed. Sometimes no sound came out at all. But he kept going, determined to give one final performance. What else can I be but what I am? The band played softly behind him, giving him the melody he could no longer produce himself. The studio was silent except for Sammy's broken whisper and the sound of people crying. I've got to be me. I've got to be me. When he finished, or rather, when his voice finally gave out completely, the studio gave him a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Not the wild, excited applause of a great performance, but the respectful, heartbroken applause of people witnessing courage in its purest form. Johnny stood and embraced Sammy again, holding him up as much as hugging him. When they pulled apart, Johnny said something that would become equally famous. Sammy, for 40 years, you've given everything you had on every stage you ever walked onto. Tonight you gave even more than that. You gave us grace. You gave us dignity. You showed us how to face the end with courage and love. Sammy smiled, that incredible smile that had lit up Broadway and Vegas and television sets around the world. He touched Johnny's face, a gesture of affection between two friends who'd known each other longer than many marriages last. Then, with his last bit of strength, Sammy whispered one more thing. This time only Johnny heard it. The microphone didn't pick it up. The audience couldn't hear. But Johnny later said it was the most important thing Sammy said all night. Thank you for letting me be myself on your show. Always myself. After the show, Johnny did something unprecedented. He went to his dressing room and removed the microphone that Sammy had used, the one that had picked up those whispered final messages. He put it in a case and told his assistant that it was never to be used again. This was Sammy's microphone, Johnny said. His last performance. Nobody else should use it. Sammy Davis Jr. died on May 16, 1990, exactly 8 weeks after that Tonight Show appearance. He was 64 years old. At his funeral, attended by thousands, Johnny Carson spoke. And during his eulogy, he played audio from that final appearance. Sam S. whispered words. Tell them I love them all. Sammy loved performing more than breathing, Johnny said. He loved making people happy. He loved the audience, the stage, the lights, the music. And even when cancer had taken his voice, even when he had weeks left to live, he insisted on one more performance. Not because he needed the applause, but because he needed to say goodbye and to say thank you. Johnny kept that microphone for the rest of his life. After he retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, it was one of the few items he took with him. When asked about it, he'd tell people about Sammy's final appearance and why that microphone mattered so much. That microphone captured the last words of one of the greatest entertainers who ever lived, Johnny would say. But more than that, it captured something rare. A moment of pure, unfiltered love between a performer and his audience. Sammy didn't whisper those words because he was weak. He whispered them because they were too important to shout. The footage from that final appearance became one of the most requested clips in Tonight Show history. Performers would cite it as the moment that made them understand what entertainment really meant. Medical students studying end-of-life care would watch it to understand dignity and grace. And millions of people who'd never seen Sammy perform in his prime would watch it and understand why he was legendary. Because in that final appearance, barely able to speak, unable to sing, with death waiting weeks away, Sammy Davis Jr. gave the performance of his lifetime, not through dance or song or spectacle, but through courage, love, and the determination to say goodbye on his own terms. The lesson wasn't about talent or fame or success. It was about what you do when everything is taken from you except your heart. Sammy couldn't dance anymore, couldn't sing, could barely speak, but he could still love, still show grace, still teach the world about dignity. That night, he showed millions of people that you don't need a voice to have something important to say. You don't need strength to show courage, and you don't need years ahead of you to make a moment meaningful. All you need is love for what you do and the people you do it for, and the courage to show up even when showing up is the hardest thing you've ever done. Sammy Davis Jr. showed up that night. He whispered his love to 12 million people. He tried to sing one more time with a voice destroyed by cancer. And he reminded everyone watching that the greatest performances aren't measured in applause or accolades, but in the courage it takes to step onto the stage. Johnny Carson kept Sammy's microphone as a reminder, not of loss or death or sadness, but of the incredible privilege of witnessing grace under the worst circumstances. Of seeing a friend refuse to let cancer take the one thing it couldn't touch, his love for his audience and his art. I've interviewed thousands of people, Johnny said in 1992, during his final Tonight Show. But that night with Sammy, that night when he could barely speak but insisted on saying goodbye, that was the most important interview I ever did because it wasn't about entertainment anymore. It was about love and courage and the human spirit refusing to quit even when the body is failing. The microphone sits in a museum now, preserved as one of television's most important artifacts. The plaque reads, used by Sammy Davis Jr. during his final Tonight Show appearance, March 13, 1990, 8 weeks before his death. Sammy whispered to America, "Tell them I love them all." This microphone captured those final words. Sometimes people ask why that moment mattered so much, why millions of people remember where they were when they watched it, why it's still shown in film schools and hospitals and anywhere. People need to understand the human capacity for grace. The answer is simple. Because Sammy Davis Jr., dying from throat cancer with his voice destroyed and his time running out, used his last appearance on The Tonight Show not to ask for sympathy or to rage against the dying of the light, but to say thank you. To tell million strangers that he loved them. To remind everyone that entertainment is a gift and he'd been privileged to give it. That's why Johnny kept the microphone. That's why the moment became legendary. And that's why more than 3 decades later, people still watch that footage and cry. Not just because Sammy was dying, but because he showed us all how to die with love, with grace, and with gratitude for every moment we're given. If this powerful story moved you, please share it. Remember, we never know when we're giving our final performance. Make every moment